Hello. Okay, most of this is going to be an addendum to the archetypes of the collective unconscious, or my previous video, whatever it's titled now. And probably the minority of it will be the next two lectures that Jung gave. It will be on those lectures, sorry. The second of the three, the concept of the collective unconscious, and then the last one, concerning the archetypes, with special reference to the anima concept. And that these are in the collected works. Because for the most part I'm critical of Jung, I want to clarify that there's good things about Jung. First of all, his whole idea, which is really coming from Nietzsche, that he's continuing about the good not being nice necessarily, or being deeper than nice, you might say. About the good man being also the strong man necessarily, who is capable of inflicting punishment or pain and being able then to stop evil, although Nietzsche doesn't put it like that. I think this is crucial, this idea coming from Nietzsche, and he is getting it from Aristotle, where Aristotle is talking about justice as a virtue, the ability to render what is due to each. Pleasure to those who do good, pain to those who do bad. That's part of it, anyway. It's not the only one, but it's a very good one. And of course, as an Orthodox Christian, I don't think there's any incompatibility here with Christianity. Most of Nietzsche's critiques, and it looks like Jung's, are of Western Christianity or dominant trends therein. They never seem to even acknowledge that there's such a thing as Eastern thoughts, Christianity especially. I've read all of his works except for his posthumous and aphoristic works, although I read some of All Too Human. I don't remember him saying anything about Eastern Christianity. Of course, Jung, as we'll see, does mention it. The next good thing that he speaks of is initiation rites, for young men especially, and just this whole idea of individuation, or in other words, having a personal vocation. In my experience, the clergy in the Orthodox Church are trustworthy, and it's very rare compared to most people. They are trustworthy men. At the same time, I've found a kind of theme among them, but usually this is among the older generation, where they don't seem to acknowledge that an individual has an individual path in life. And if you're struggling to find your place in the world, they're going to just point you to Christianity in the abstract. Find the kingdom first, and then everything shall be added unto you. Of course, relying on that is like magic when you have a particular problem to solve. You aren't just human nature, you're an individual. And I found that most people don't care who you are or to know about the world in general in any deep fashion. They find their niche, they have their families, period. That's just how it is. Doesn't matter how practical or how much you practice Christianity in the abstract, which means the general rules, asceticism, praying, fasting. Doesn't matter how much of those you do, you're not going to find your place in the world that way. Finding your place in the world is, of course, it should be done together with those religious things, but it is its own area of activity that requires its own energy expenditure. The ascetic fathers are trying to add an inward movement to the soul, which is usually, for us, stuck in outward movement to its detriment. But I don't think they literally mean to cease all outward movement. And people who deny the sense of belonging somewhere in the world deny telos. And so they're modernist to that degree. That's what modernists do. They deny belonging, purpose. And some want to deny it for the individual, but ascribe it only to nature. You'll find modernism in the Orthodox Church, although it doesn't belong there. Irony intended. And there's nothing about living in the world that's against Christianity, despite all the rhetoric of the fathers being against the world. They mean a very specific thing by the world. They don't mean that ideally all Christians are monastics, even if monasticism was treated as, on the whole, the better or higher path, since pastorally it is up to the individual, and there is an ideal here that depends on the individual. With the word world, are they referring to the world God created, the cosmos, or civilization from the line of Cain, the world as it has fallen, or just the nexus of the passions? Or what monastics renounce from 1 John 2:16, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. But in fact, they affirm marriage, and so living in the world, and so finding a place in it. So, as far as I've seen, and it would be really helpful if clergy could see this, they don't acknowledge, and I'm talking about older, kind of like the boomer generation and older maybe. They don't acknowledge the need for initiation and for a bit of guidance. Guidance may not be the primary role that a patriarch should have, because the individual's direction must be self-determined, but there is need for a little guidance, which is tied to the role of protecting. Protecting is kind of like guiding. I accept the idea of the church as like a seed bank for civilization, or like a potential breakaway civilization, you could even say. And we see evidence of that in the hermits, the monastic hermits who go out into the woods trying to escape civilization and good repute and everyone, and then whole towns eventually build themselves around them, around these saints. And then there's the image of the church as the ark, right? When civilization is flooded, and there's this breakaway civilization, the ark. These are valid. These are true images. You can call it a seed bank for civilization, or you can call it a potential breakaway civilization. But the thing is, you have to take the seed out and water it. This doesn't happen for you. You have to actually affirm civilization then. Why be misers, hiding gold or burying the talents? You take out the seeds, plant them, water them. You can grow. You have to grow. And was it trestles, adding trestles like for plants. And anyway, grow a functioning culture. And so a functioning society from the church as a basis or center of that. Yeah, I know there's some notion of it being kind of a more minimal, austere civilization, and there's varying ideas of how much civilization you want, whether you're going to have an ivory tower. I think it's best if we don't have an ivory tower, but you can't prevent the wealthy from how they use their money, and you should have some kind of academy. What I envision is a culture that drops the development of iPhones and drone swarm bombing techniques and pursues mastery in fields in the humanities. I realize that's a pipe dream given the line of Cain. But anyway, you should steer some course between Philistinism and the ivory tower, I think. That's what you should do. Although there is a subculture in the church that has received the tradition a certain way and interprets it a certain way, which is pretty anti-humanistic, pretty rigorous. They're the crypto-Gnostics, really. I'm talking about them right now. So that's the second good thing. It's the idea of an initiation. And of course, with society as it is, with culture as it is, ever since the sexual revolution, the implementation of no-fault divorce, and now with all the other stuff I probably shouldn't mention on YouTube, there's a pandemic of fatherlessness in our society. I think it's the real form of poverty. You might ask, why does the Black community have such a problem? Fatherlessness in that community is higher than any other in America. It's probably not a coincidence. So lacking an initiation for young men, lacking some amount of career guidance or kind of scaffolding for practical personal skills that it takes to eventually pursue your career in the world, and fatherlessness, these are all correlated, and it's rampant in our culture now. And even in the time of Jung, I think it was starting up. Even the boomers seem to have felt pretty alienated from their parents. So Jung actually sees that's a problem, whether or not his solution is genuine or fake. While I disagree with what he's offering, at least he sees it, and I'll mention this later, but he's anti-philosophy, yet very philosophical, and I can appreciate that anti-philosophy temperament about him, although I disagree with him there. I also appreciate that he was a farmer in a way. I mean, he grew up on a farm. He got in fights. He would talk about that. He's a tough guy. And there's some value to that. That there's somebody who took that role, yet who read philosophy. All the way up to Kant, although, unfortunately he stopped there. And so he was, you could say, tainted by it. But at the same time, it's a good thing to have somebody who's trying to be practical. And we can give the benefit of the doubt that he was genuinely trying to help people. He was seeing neurotics and trying to help them in his practice, for example. Next, the idea of archetypes, I think, is an important extension of Plato into the literary realm. He sounds like a realist, although again, as a crypto-philosopher whose persona is a psychoanalyst, he never really takes a hard stance on that. But I think it's pretty clear he is talking about patterns in reality. He likes to say we can't say anything about reality outside our minds. He takes that Kantian stance. Reality for him is the unconscious. We can't say anything about what's outside of consciousness or unconsciousness, what's outside of our experience or collective experience. So let's just not even talk about that. The real is going to consist of intelligible patterns. So this is part of what marks Jung as one of the early steps away from the mechanical reductionist project in the West, especially the Anglo-West, to the reductionist, empiricist, mechanical worldview. But as they come to the immaterialist or anti-reductionist phase, new instances of whom are, for example, Ian McGilchrist, John Vervaeke, Jordan Peterson, these non-religious types who are trying to combine science and religion, and before them, supposedly, Piaget, we could say Teilhard de Chardin. These figures start to say more valuable things just for recognizing a non-material reality and talking about what its nature must be. Just kind of like how the Neoplatonists, even when they were anti-Christian, like Platon, were always in dialogue with orthodoxy. They have a lot more of a robust understanding of reality than the reductionist material types. So Jung fits in that category of spiritual, not religious, but also scientific types. Next comment I wanted to make was on the moral realism point. I was talking about Jungianism in the way that I see the pretense to being beyond good and evil play out usually. But there is a form of beyond good and evil that even we can accept. I would point to chapter 38 of the Tao Te Ching, where Lao Tzu is talking about how when the way is lost, then you have the de. When the de or virtue is lost, then you have benevolence, which is like doing good naturally. But then when benevolence is lost, you have righteousness. That's where you have to force yourself. And when righteousness is lost, then you have the rights, where if other people aren't obeying, the man of the rights rolls up his sleeve and applies force to them too. Right and wrong, I think, even in the West, has always been seen as just small components of an overall virtue theory. Only in modern times, like with Kant, is this notion of the right reduced to righteousness, to use Lao Tzu's terms. Right and wrong are sort of like conclusions in your judgment of a situation, particularly about what should be thought, said, or done. And there's so many factors prior to that that are relevant: values, non-moral facts, a value structure that need to be seen and weighed and interpreted. So, of course, there's deeper things than right and wrong in the sense of a conclusion, because what's behind the conclusion, but also in the sense of the good, or eudaimonia, or human flourishing. What is good as a universal is deeper than right and wrong. Heraclitus says seawater is good for fish and it dehydrates us to death. Sure, it's relative in this sense, but what if the relationship is real? What if relationships are real? What is good for human beings constitutes their best relationships with the world themselves, God. Why think this relationship isn't real and the whole world built around it when it is so markedly different from the worst, wicked, languishing, and degenerate forms of relationship? Just because right and wrong presupposes the particulars of situations in relating to the good doesn't mean there is no right and wrong. Just because the ocean is deep doesn't mean there's no surface. And what is right is just a surface layer. And beyond it, going up, so to speak, into the good or supererogatory, this contains endless variation, just like there are endless ways of going wrong. So, of course, a moral realist can accept some sense of beyond good and evil if we're going to take good to be just right, or what Lao Tzu would say is at the level of righteousness. Now, benevolence and the de, or virtue above that, both occupy the same conceptual space as virtue to Plato and Aristotle, but it's a little hard to tease that out because Lao Tzu is working with wu wei, or actionless action, which perhaps captures the aspect of the virtuous man or woman doing what is good spontaneously because it comes from their character or developed disposition. But I'm not a scholar on like Taoism and stuff. So, and then even beyond virtue, of course, There's the specifically Christian interpersonal, practical, experiential relationship with God through asceticism, through the sacraments, and theosis, deification. So of course we think there's something beyond ethics, or what about nature and normative rules in nature that is accessible to reason? Or what about nature is accessible to reason? In a sense, you might say that is going beyond just, okay, now the saint has virtue and he's going beyond that. He's being perfected. In other words, he's going deeper and deeper into the sacred, which is more and more of an interpersonal thing and less about restoring the image or human nature per se. And it's beyond even illumination about mere logi, or the natures of things, principles of things. But then there's another sense of beyond good and evil that's not just like the edgelord, I'm a moral nihilist and I have no reason for that, but I just see things that way because I want to excuse myself for my vices or whatever, or I want to feel special. There's something beyond even that, which is, if Jung is saying that reality is beyond all of our categories, kind of like a Kantian would, all reality outside of the human being is beyond categories. And if that means the real human being is beyond the categories, the human mind, everything about the human, beyond the human's own conscious categories, if that's part of reality, then the self and the world are the same, since there are no categories to distinguish them. That's kind of, okay, let me back up. He says that in one of these lectures, and it's also God, because that's how we see God, beyond all the categories. So let me read that again. If Jung is saying that reality is beyond all of our categories, all reality outside of the human being is beyond categories, if he's saying that, and if that means the real human being is beyond the categories, the human mind, everything about the human, beyond his own conscious categories, if that's part of reality, then the self and the world are the same, since there are no categories to distinguish them. All right, you might have to play it again. I'm sorry. This kind of German idealist stuff, like a bit of Schopenhauer there. Sorry. Apologies. I don't want to go through the German idealist dialectic of why that has to be so. It's not the place for this. But that's pantheism, and we can't accept that. That's a huge mess, or a conflation of things to us. We don't think that just everything is outside of the categories. We think God alone is outside of the categories, and in a sense, everything is made in the image of God. And so we could say, only God, who's omniscient and is able to understand everything, is then in the position to be able to understand any one thing, because any one thing is what it is in relation to everything else. So yeah, in that sense, every individual thing is also beyond the categories. In a similar way, St. Demetrius Staniloy says God is apophatically beyond us. And since all things are created in his image, with this mysterious God as their basis, this means also all things are not completely knowable. There's another parallel disagreement between Florovsky and Bulgakov, because we could say the Logos is the thought of the Father, and the Logos becomes the blueprint for the created world. And if the Logos has many logi, as his many aspects, and he is eternal, then they are eternal. And if he is not dependent on the Father's will, but from the Father's nature, then they are uncreated as well. So these would be uncreated divine ideas of creation. And so strictly in this sense, creation before it's created is divine. But I am not so sure about this. And this is, I believe, what Bulgakov was saying, and Florovsky thought it was outright pantheism. I believe Florovsky thought the divine ideas were eternal, but willed into being, and that the Logos was not already in some sense multiple logi prior to the divine ideas. But clearly the connection between the divine ideas and the Logos is unique in the Trinity. That's all I can say. In any case, this shows our panentheism, but we can't get behind the collapse of distinctions in pantheism, which Jung is advocating here. All right, on to the ironies and a little bit of critique here. The theologians or seminarians that he mentions are in paragraph 34. He speaks of a Protestant theologian. On paragraph 40, another theologian. And in paragraph 70, a young theological student. So we know only one of them is Protestant. The other two we don't know. But he's condescending in his treatment of all three. I don't necessarily disagree, but what is his reason? Paragraph 41, he calls them timorous souls, kind of mocking this theologian for not knowing about how you have to go down before you can come back up. Like go down like humbly before you can be exalted. In Eastern Orthodoxy, there's the idea of kenosis, or self-emptying. So is it a problem with these theologians not having the Orthodox tradition? It seems so. He also, on paragraph 21, for almost no reason at all in this text, says that the dogma are lesser than symbols somehow, but he gives no explanation for this. To us, dogma are part of cataphatic theology, which is only part of the truth. The Western tradition lost hold of this distinction, or Catholics, since Aquinas, failed to prioritize the apophatic. The apophatic is even deeper than the symbolic, which is what Jung wants. And Dionysius the Areopagite already spelled out levels to the cataphatic, although I don't remember him mentioning dogma or where it goes in the hierarchy relative to symbols, but he does mention symbols in the cataphatic. And we see in patristic biblical exegesis the symbolic as key and not synonymous with dogma. So again, another response from the Orthodox tradition to Jung. In paragraph 11, he mentions Eastern Orthodoxy. He speaks of the treasure chest of the East, be that Christian or Buddhist, quote unquote. And he says, quote, that will nourish the passion for show and new clothes for a long time, end quote. And he says it's superficial. So the best we're going to get from Eastern Orthodoxy to Jung is, in complete contrast to the Orthodox responses I've just given, is passion for show and new clothes. Again, that's paragraph 11 where he mentions it. And then he mentions surrendering to the Christian symbol gets you someone like Kierkegaard, neurotic to Jung, or an overly sophisticated I-thou relationship, he says. So I think he's alluding to the Jewish theologian Buber or maybe Levinas. In paragraph 29, he says we should renounce false spiritual riches. That's like the virtue of poverty, which is really the renouncing of riches, but here it's the renouncing of false spiritual riches. Okay, he calls them all the allurements of the odorous East included. So while he does seem to praise Hinduism, most especially in his first lecture, he wants to get beyond that, and he mentions inheritance several times. So for some reason, European or Western man has not inherited these things. I find this ironic, but because he's okay with Christianity as long as it's Gnostic Christianity, but Gnosticism is further removed from Western man than Orthodoxy. Rome, even Western Rome, was Orthodox all the way to 1054. So you only have small Gnostic sects flower in the early centuries and then intersperse throughout history, kind of their own mystic heretical strain, but usually the minority. So this is just strange. Where is he getting this idea of inheritance? And somehow we haven't inherited Orthodoxy. Also, I should add that there would be no Western Renaissance and probably then no West without Byzantium. In the 100 or so years before it fell in 1453, a lot of Greek intellectuals fled because they saw it coming, the collapse, and they fled to Italy, Padua, Genoa, pardon me if I'm not saying those right, places like that, where they were welcomed for their education, and they laid the foundation for the Renaissance. So what is this? Orthodoxy is not Western man's inheritance. There would be no Renaissance in the West without Byzantium, arguably. See Runciman on this. So again, what about Eastern Rome, which continued all the way to 1453? Are those not Western man? The only reason it's not Western is because the name for Eastern Orthodoxy is Eastern Orthodox, but then we can ask the question again, why isn't Eastern Orthodoxy part of the West? It was all the way until 1054. So suddenly after the schism, 1054, which is only the official date, but let's say it's 1054, suddenly we get our West and East defined, and now we have an Eastern Orthodoxy instead of Roman Catholicism, and we're Eastern, but not part of Asia. We're not part of the Middle East or the East, really. So it's what? It's also historians, I think, who are responsible for peddling this ignorance about Byzantium. Rome fell, they'll say, in the 300s, right? So for some reason, that's not our inheritance, even though the East was Roman as well. Constantinople was Roman. They consider themselves Romans. Is it because they're Greeks? We get rid of them from our category like the Russians and send them to the East because they're Asiatic. But they're not. Greece is part of the West. I don't know. It's just so arbitrary. It's liberal Enlightenment propaganda, really. You have Islamic and Judeo-Talmudic civilizations in the Middle East, and you have the Indian and Asian civilizations in the East or Far East. It's really that simple. The West, in my opinion, includes Russia and Greece and Georgia, despite the Asiatic blood and influences. Blood and spatial geometry doesn't define this for me, but religion. So this category has been redefined in a suspicious way. Also, I find it ironic that he dismisses philosophers. He dismisses Max Scheler in this lecture. As a side note, I'd recommend Why Jung Hated Philosophers on The Living Philosophy online. It's a blog. A bit of humility about philosophy might have helped him to avoid the problem I'm about to describe because he's doing philosophy, so it's good to know about the field. Psychology isn't a separate field. It's philosophy that, like all philosophy, can be supported by empirical data and mathematical handling of the data. I don't think he has any grounds to dismiss Christ. His position is self-undermining. I don't know whether he places his position, his psychoanalysis, within a line or a cycle. A line on the one hand of progress, of individuation, where culturally, collectively, we contain more and more of the unconsciousness, but in fits and starts, a wave, you might say, with like an overall upward trajectory, or on the other hand, whether it's some kind of strict circular cycle. I don't know which one it is, but either way, he says that the symbolic order always becomes thin and dies, that the king always has to die. Okay, his own ideas are part of a symbolic order, so then they too have to die. They too are not really true then. So on what grounds is he standing to say that we need to leave behind Christianity? There is no ground. By the way, also he talks about why Protestantism is so bad, which I agree it is. Iconoclastic is why. And it leads to nihilism, he says, which I agree. But his reason is that it's iconoclastic. It hollows out the symbols, he means, and what you're left with is this abstract dogma, is what he means. That seems to be his problem. It's dogma, and it's too abstract. And yet he's talking about an archetype of an old man, archetype of the mother, archetype of rebirth, archetype of meaning in life. These are very abstract. So I guess it's supposed to be a little more rich than Protestant dogma. And so it's some sort of progress, but it's going to end up the same as the rest of them according to his own thought, right? All traditions have to die. And also, don't look at the superficial East, which has the symbols that are much more rich than meaning in life in general or the mother in general. No, the symbols, the scriptural symbols, they're narratively and historically rich. What he's giving us is abstractions from myths. That's great, but why is that any more rich and concrete than sacred history and scripture? I don't see a reason for a competition between them. The Bible itself plays on myths, for example. For example, the Old Testament writers respond to polytheistic myths in deep ways that acknowledges what is true in them. It's not just the curses and threats you see on the surface level. See Levinson's creation and the persistence of evil on the topic of Chaos Kampf and Leviathan. So yeah, as I wrote, he claims to be able to know the right process. Jung claims to know the right process, the dialectic one, and he knows this on his own. He calls it a dialectic, and how he knows that this is progress is mysterious. If he knows it as part of a tradition, psychoanalytic, Kabbalist, Hegelian as it seems to be, then that itself is self-undermined and will undergo untold amounts of transformation into the next symbolic order. So what ground does he have to prefer Gnostic perennialism to Christianity? Doesn't seem to have one. You'd have to do some legwork elsewhere to show how his view is at this pinnacle of the cycle, or at least after Christ in the line of progress, despite the death of all symbolic orders, which would include his own. Okay, so the lecture, the concept of the collective unconscious. In this, he attempts to define the collective unconscious. I said before in the last lecture, I think that archetypes, in his last lecture, I think that archetypes are part of reality. That's not exactly accurate. He says that the archetypes compose the contents of the collective unconscious, and in this, he's going to say that the archetypes are like instinctual patterns, so not exactly parts of reality. They're the patterns of the instincts, and they're inherited. They're inborn. And they've developed from a long process of dealing with reality in its parts. Pretty much, I think what he's saying is that there's going to be typical situations going through life, and those typical situations are going to be genetically recorded in the body and then transmitted to and inherited by the next generation, and their experience is going to be recorded as well, and it's going to be refined over the ages, and each typical situation in life is going to activate one of the archetypes, he says. Now, this raises some questions like, why do individuals have such a problem with the archetypes if they are just instinctual? I mean, you just get them downloaded at birth, and there you are. All the instincts of all your ancestors dealing with the typical situations of life are just there, ready to go. So where's the problem? Where do we get this conflict where he's talking about neurotics and psychotics and, these pathologies of not integrating the archetypes? So while it kind of gets his empirical credentials when talking to the more reductive scientist types to say that they're like, well, there are instincts, and you believe in instincts, so you should believe in archetypes too. Still, now he has another problem, which is, well, how do you explain this conflict? The way that I would think is the best, most charitable way to read this is that the symbolic order becomes corrupt, and the individual might not cooperate. You need these three things to be harmonized. So you get your download through genetics, and in order for that to pass into the phenotypic expression properly, it needs to be guided by a well-functioning culture and the individual's cooperation. The way that he makes it sound is kind of like the current symbolic order is corrupt, and it's sort of transplanted into the psyche of the individual during his or her upbringing, and then is rejected like a transplanted organ can be rejected by the immune system because it's interpreted as alien or not belonging by the immune system. That's the way it seemed when I read this. But he also takes it to be like a path of development, and you're supposed to become quite refined and individuated and balanced. And we don't think of instincts that way, as becoming very sophisticated and refined. Instincts are like crude and rudimentary. And even he doesn't see them that way. He talks about the anima, for example, being archaic, and it took 1,000 years of Christianity to pry apart the idea of beauty from the idea of goodness. And he talks about the NAZIS in his time, this archaic and crude revival that's based on instincts, he'll say. So it definitely seems like he sees that there's a crucial role for culture and some form of mental activity that is not just instinctual. And while he makes fun of reason as too abstract, or maybe you could say left brain dominant thinking, and he says, no, quote, no cool reflection, philosophy, or science can help us. Traditional religion, only to a limited degree, intellect with categories is powerless. On paragraph 66, he does mention his own preferred style of thinking as this older, empirical, and yet interior kind of thinking, what we would call noetic, where you're perceiving thoughts. You're not really thinking thoughts, you're perceiving them. And he also mentions dialogue with the psychoanalyst, a dialectic process of dialogue. So these two things, together with this noetic perception, is supposed to form kind of his preferred culture, I guess, to help integrate the collective unconscious into the individual's consciousness. Right, and then in the finishing third part, concerning the archetypes, with special reference to the anima concept, I was a bit disappointed because he doesn't really talk about the anima. Instead, he compares it to a genus, like the concept of arthropod, where there's different species within that genus. Pretty abstract, tisk tisk, Not supposed to be abstract, Jung. And there's a lot of work he's trying to do to get his empirical credentials, like he's kind of talking to the scientific community, trying to prove his ideas of science. We'll see here his very Kantian description, so it's very clear that he's influenced by Kant. He seems to criticize philosophers after Kant because, well, maybe it's just because he didn't read them. He has a good point in here that the idea of the soul should be accepted, since even the idea of an atom is, he says, mythical. I would say metaphysical. And yes, the atom, or this irreducible thing, has never been empirically found or seen. It's sort of just a metaphysical posit of scientists. And if they can posit that, they should be able to accept the soul. It's a good point. He talks about syzygies, S-Y-Z-Y-G-I-E-S, in this lecture. We see a lot of usual psychoanalytic apparatus here. He talks about projection and transference and incest fantasy, the idea that religion just fulfills a psychic need for an ideal mother and father figure, again, the syzygy, without which we have this sense of homelessness. Again, I don't accept these things. I think this is just another way of trying to demoralize people. Thanks again, Agent 488 of the OSS. There's a reason he attracted the attention of Alan Dulles and was recruited by him, because he's on board with pushing these kinds of things. It's just another way to try to demoralize people and get them prepared for a different order, a new religion of the kind from folks like Blavatsky and the Theosophists that he mentions. The other figures that I mentioned, Jordan Peterson as well, yeah. So this idea of an incest fantasy doesn't really do any theoretical work. What is this supposed to explain? And the way that he tries to argue for its existence was not convincing here. It's more likely that this is just a form of symbolic terrorism, which they've done in art, trying to make you feel like a dirty, weak, or rabid, perverted monkey, descendant of monkeys or proto-monkeys, right? Just like that combination of Darwin, Freud, and Marx. Darwin, you're just the monkey. You have incest fantasies, so you're a perverted monkey. And then, you're also this rabid, power-hungry monkey. So there's your Marxism, or conflict theory of society. You're this weak monkey because you need religion, because you need the ideal mother-father, which again, all of this, because you're weak, you can't accept that you're going to die and the nothingness after death. And you can do that. You can interpret religion from the atheist point of view. You can interpret religion from the anti-Christian atheism, but that's not arguing for it. That's assuming your conclusion. That's just, assuming your conclusion and interpreting somebody else's view from it. We can do that too. It's not an argument. I know he's other things, not just an atheist. He's a perennialist, he's a Gnostic, whatever, but there's the anti-Christian atheism, which is there in his writing here. And I say I'm a little disappointed with that aspect because he has just done so much work vindicating symbols, myths, and God's world, although not religion. But in the end, he has to say he can't know what is out there outside of the Kantian ego, and is going to just say then that there's nothing really there, and there's just a felt psychological need for this, for the belief that there is. Or maybe there is something there. We shouldn't talk about true or false about this, he thinks, but there is the need. So it's kind of wishy-washy. I guess it's not as hardline an atheism as Freud's. But anyway, that's that for that. And remember, you are not a weak, perverted, rabid monkey necessarily. Anyway, you're made in the image of God. So there is no excuse for degenerate behavior.